Right, so middle of Eis Hey of Yom Tov Shel Rosh Hashanah Tashuvim Gimel the Hemshech, page Tov Chav Hey, and Sefer Mar Melukat Chelik Aleph. Until now, we've asked the questions on the idea of Yom Tov of Rosh Hashanah on Shabbos. We don't blow a shofar. We asked two main questions, and then he introduced us to the idea of starting from the Baal Shem Tov, Chedesh, that every year, that on Rosh Hashanah the Chedesh, the Tiku, the Tikus, is Baal Chedesh with the Chidush. Before that, he told us about before that, he told us from the Tzemach Tzedek, upon which this whole Maimer is based on, the idea of mitzvahs, alidei Isarusa de la Tata, Isarusa de la Elam. And that's what we're going through over here. That's the theme of the whole Maimer, that what we do here affects what goes on up there. And as a result of that, it comes back down and affects what happens in this world. And then he explained that again from the perspective of the famous word of the Mazin Shemagid, with Mishnah in Pirkei Avos, Da Malamayla is Mimoch. Good morning.
Thank you.
Then in Beis, we went on to explain the idea of that mitzvahs have their shadish very high, and therefore, through the mitzvahs, there's a hamshacha that comes down into the whole world. And mitzvah shefer is a mitzvah klolis, which affects all the mitzvahs of the whole year. Then we can start understanding why we don't blow shefer on Rosh Hashanah, which he goes through Gimel and Dalad, and he explains us what is Shabbos. Shabbos is two levels of Tainug, one that's given installed by the Eibishter in Shabbos, and one that we contribute to Shabbos. But shefer is the equivalent of that level of Tainug, and therefore the blowing shefer on Shabbos doesn't need to be with that whole shturim, he says, and therefore we can take into consideration the concern that somebody may carry on Shabbos. Because whatever is normally achieved through Shabbos, through shefer, is achieved on Shabbos. Then in Daled he says even more than that. Not just that does shefer achieve up there what is normally achieved on Shabbos, not just the Shabbos achieve up there what normally is achieved in Shofar, but also has an effect down here as well. It draws down into this world as well. The highest of all the elements, and that is because on Shabbos, during the week, the Machaya the elements with the ACS Hadibur, and on Shabbos is Machaya the elements with ACS Hamachshava. However, in the Beis Hamikdash, it's not like that. In the Beis Hamikdash, it's a higher level, and even the Tainug of Shabbos doesn't reach that level, which can be reached through blowing shofar in the Beis Hamikdash. Because of the Kedusha that there is in the Beis Hamikdash, as we'll see later, he uses the expression, the Kedusha that permeates even the Avonim, even the stones of the Beis Hamikdash. And therefore, the Kedusha is much higher over there, and it needs to have Shefer too. Okay. Then in Hay, he starts into a new angle, and he starts this idea of Einik, now to analyze and explain the Einik that there is in mitzvahs. This is two levels of Einik. There's the Tainug, we're talking about the Tainug of the Eibishter. So there's the Tainug that the Eibishter has when Yidden Amakayim mitzvahs in general, because it's fulfillment of the Eibishter's Ratzon. So there's the Tainug of fulfilling the Ratzon, and that is B'chlalas and all mitzvahs. And then he says higher than that is the Tainug that there is in each individual mitzvah. And he says that this actually is a chidush of this Maimer, because everywhere else, and that's by the 49, he refers to the other places. In other places, Chassidus explain the exact opposite. The kavanah protis in each mitzvah is lower than the kavanah klolis. And here he says that the tainug proti is higher than the individual specific tainug is higher than the general tainug that the Eibishter has from kiyum mitzvahs. And this he explains by telling us that there's the tainug as it is in the Giluya tainug, and then there's the tainug as it is b'chlolos. There's the Tainug Proti, and then there's the Tainug as it is in Mokara Tanugim, where over there, Tainug is not yet experienced. We gave last week the analogy, the example of, for example, we're familiar with Seichel. I think we did this last week. That Seichel is experienced, and we're familiar with it. And we can talk Seichel with each other. But Seichel comes from what we know, the Seichel that we know is a level of Bina. But that's Bina, that Bina came from Chochmah. But in Chochmah, it's not yet identifiable as a Dvar Seichel, as an intellect. It only happens in Bina. So similar to that is over here. There's the Tainug, which is the experienced Tainug, and then there's the Tainug as it is in Mokara Tainugim. So he's saying that the tainug that David has from klolos mitzvahs is the experiential tainug. And then, however, the tainug that there is from the pratim in the mitzvahs, that's a higher level. That's the chiddush of the Tzemach Tzedek over here. And therefore, he explains, that's why shofar, as we said last week, it's not just a shofar. The device is called shofar for the reason because it comes from the word shipur. He gave a few psukim, but here he focused on the word anis and imrei shofar, and later we're going to see another one, shipur masechem. But the point being that it's the idea of beautification, which is the idea of tainug. Then he asks the question, let's start from the lecheda and move on. Right after the parentheses, anis and imrei shofar. And that's about 5, I don't know which sefer you have, but it's almost where we reached last week. You see it? The lecheda and move on. If you're using the link that I sent you, it's about halfway through the page probably. Right after the kama, hanes and imrei shofar in parentheses. Lecheda and move on. Hadinyan atainagu kishesh kama protum dafka. Tainug in general, generalizing, of course there's exceptions, but generally speaking, tainug, pleasure, comes when there's a mixture, a harmony of different things. Like, we give the examples of music, not just one instrument, a choir, not just one solo voice, food that's spiced with various different tastes and spices. That's the talent of cooking nice food, to be able to mix in all sorts of different flavorings. That's where you have tainug, as opposed to bland, plain food without any flavor, or just one song, one singer, or one musical instrument. So he says, like he says, about tainug should be keil, nigun, whether it's voice or klizemer, instruments. The tainug is davke kishesh harkava shel kama kelis. The tainug will be when there's a composition of a number of sounds. So the question, therefore, is given the shofar of keil echad. Shofar is a solo voice. It's not particularly a very nice voice sound. So how could it be that shofar should be the symbol of tainug, as we're saying all along here? In fact, the reality is, we see the keil shofar ain't by tainug. It does not have any tainug at all. In fact, with the sound of the shofar, it doesn't inspire a person to pleasure. It inspires trepidation, as it says in the pasuk. Also that the keil of the shofar by Matan Torah was very strong, and that the nation was in trepidation. Later on, he's going to connect the shofar with Matan Torah. That's why he's bringing out the psukim of Matan Torah. Uksiv by the 55, Vayaron Vayanu Vayamdu Merochik, that they stood from a distance because they were so trembling. What will happen because of this tremendous gilui, the most greatest and amazing and wondrous gilui of keil shofar aleim hoifata, that he revealed himself, appeared before them. They were in a complete state of bittul. Vayam merachik. And charada and bittul are the exact opposite of tainug, or hepech tainug. So how can shofar? How can this device, which we call shofar, which means delight, and tainug, how can shofar be the symbol of delight? But tainug, when shofar inspires fear and trepidation and trembling. So the shofar tainug, the expression and its whole theme is tainug. How can we say that? This is what we're up to from last week. The Tzemach Tzedek explains over there the Masha Shofar of tainug. The aspect of shofar as a tainug device is because, based on what we just said in the first half of this paragraph, because there's two levels of tainug. As a sensual, that we can feel and experience the tainug, you're right. Shofar is not that. Is not a symbol for that. Shofar is tainug is because it's a tainug on the level of the tainug, which is higher than gilui tainug. Higher than the revealed tainug. That's where shofar is tainug. Shofar is the tainug on that level, of the mocker, the source of tainug. And that's why you won't find in the voice of the shofar shum hargoshas tainug klal. That's taka. You won't experience tainug there. In fact, it will inspire trepidation because because it is higher than it is tainug, but it's higher than a revealed tainug. If you struggle to understand that, think seichel, the example I gave. Bina comes from chachma, but in chachma you don't see seichel yet. But we know that it's there because the bina comes from the chachma. And you need to take Bina to develop the Chachma. But Bina didn't create something on its own. It must have come from somewhere. That's the Chachma. But in the Chachma, you don't experience Seichel. The same thing is over here. So the Shofar is a Tainug, but which Tainug? The Tainug as it is, higher than revealed Tainug. Kiim, Mibchinas Moker HaTanugim. And then, from this level where Shofar awakens the highest level of Tanugim, in the Moker of Tanugim, from there comes the details of the Tanugim into each of the mitzvahs. In other words, as it said, mentioned earlier, and he's going to say here, Shofar, which is the first mitzvah of the year, serves as the catalyst for all the mitzvahs of the year. So that when we achieve, inspire by the Eibishter, a Tainug from the mitzvah of Shofar, it therefore affects the mitzvahs of all of the year as well. By the Eibishter and by us. That's why, so here's another diuk, right? We said, like last week, we said that Lashon HaKodesh, nothing is by chance. Everything is precise. It's the Eibishter's language. So the fact that he called it Shofar is because it's connected to the Shadish of the word Shofar, which means to beautify. Shipru Masechem, Imri Shever. So he says, look at the diuk. The Zeu Masha Shofar and Lashon Shipru Masechem. Which is one of the psukim that the Tzemach Tzedek brought to show us that Shofar is pleasurable. Masechem Lashon Rabim, in the plural. What's the significance of that? Because Dalidit Ki Shofar Nifal B'chol Maise U'Maise HaShipur V'Atainu Gashayach L'Maise Prati Zeh. Because through the Shofar, it has an impact on every Maise, Masechem in the plural. In every Maise that we're going to do, it's going to affect, to improve it and achieve a Tainug, which is relevant for that Maise Prati, for that individual act, or that individual mitzvah. Why? Because the Amshacha from the source of Tanugim comes down into the Ischalkos, into the detail. And therefore, it's not just Shipru, but the Shipru Masechem in the plural. You see here the precision in the Lashon HaKodesh of the Pasuk, that when you understand it, the way we're learning it here, even the Masechem, as opposed to Maseh in the singular. It affects everything that we do. What happens on Rosh Hashanah when we blow the Shofar affects us throughout the whole year. In all of our details, that's the point. In all the piratim. So the key over here is to be able to draw from Mokar Tanugim and Rosh Hashanah to affect the whole year. To give the Eibishter a lot of Tainug in the Mokar Tanugim and Rosh Hashanah, and that's specifically through Tkiyas Shofar. So we got the Shofar the Matan Torah. Now he's so to speak closing off the not in the ends. This is the connection of Shofar to Matan Torah. We say over there in the psukim of Shofar is Adon Igleisa. The Lamach Terem Mitzvahs. They should reveal himself with the Keil of the Shofar by Matan Torah at Har Sinai in order to teach Yidden Terem Mitzvahs. U'Bekeil Shofar Alehem Oifata. With the Keil Shofar you appear to them. The Matan Torah, what does that mean? The Matan Torah is Amshachas Atzmos. By the time of Matan Torah, we know the Atzmos of the Eibishter revealed itself. How did the Atzmos reveal itself? In the form of the Torah, as it says, Anechi, the Gemara says, Anechi is Rashi Tevis, Ano Nafshik Sovus Yehovis. I have installed my nefesh, my very essence of the Eibishter is in the Torah, and on Matan Torah it was revealed. And what is Atzmos? Atzmos is Amshachas Pchinas Mokar Tanugim. Atzmos brings with it this level of Mokar Tanugim, which is higher than Gilum. And that's the connection of Shofar and Matan Torah, of Rosh Hashanah and Matan Torah. Because by Matan Torah, this was revealed, which we are aiming to achieve, to reveal on Rosh Hashanah with Tkiyas Shofar. That's what was revealed on Matan Torah. And therefore, just as it works with Shofar, that the Tainug goes into all the Pratim, the same thing happened with Matan Torah. The Eibishter revealed himself in the highest level, the Mokar Tanugim. Then he went into the details, into the Aseres HaDiburis, B'chol Dibur B'frat. And then Hatainug Hashayach L'Dibur Zeh B'miyuchad. I don't know what he's trying to tell us with the parentheses. I'll call Dibur Parcha Nishmasot. How is that relevant here to the discussion? In any case, so then when the Tainug went from the Anoichi into all of the Dibur, into Aseres HaDiburis in B'frat, the Tainug which is Shayach for that particular Dibur, and Achakach it is Nimshach B'frat is even more in detail. L'lamed Lamach Torah Mitzvahs, all the Torah Mitzvahs, B'chol Mitzvah B'frat. They all came from the Anoichi. Like it happens on Rosh Hashanah, the Tainug that we're able to inspire, to awaken by the Eibishter through this device called the shofar, which means shipru, and it affects all ma'asechem. Because there's two levels of tainug, and this is the higher level, the tainug as it is in its makkah and its source. That's the mind of that's what the Tzemach Tzedek says, and as the way the Rebbe explains it. So now he elaborates. So same thing happens with Rosh Hashanah like it was by Matan Torah. Shiyam Dalet Vov, yeah. Shiyam Shachim B'chinas Moker Tanugim. That Kiyah Shefer is Hamshacha. We're drawing down from the source of the Tanugim, which is Shalom Ayla B'chinas Gilai Tanug, which again is a level which is higher than the revealed Tanug. Now, why is that? Because Rosh Hashanah, everything reverts back to its original state. As we mentioned last week, as we said we learned in Tanya in Chitas last Shabbos, not yesterday, a week ago on the Friday, in Geras Akedah Yudalet. So Rosh Hashanah, everything returns to its original. So we have to renew everything from its original source. The same thing applies to the renewal, not just of the world, but also in the covenant and the iskashlos of HaKadosh Baruch Hu in Israel. That also needs to be renewed every Rosh Hashanah. Every Rosh Hashanah, this covenant and the bond is renewed mechodosh, as it's written in the pasuk in yesterday's parsha, because of Atan Nitzavim Hayim, and the Alter Rebbe says that Hayim of this, the pasuk is talking about Hayim of Zayin Adon, the day that Moshe Rabbeinu passed away. The Alter Rebbe interprets also that Hayim also means that the day of Rosh Hashanah, Nitzavim is always read before, not Vayelech necessarily, but Nitzavim is always read the Shabbos before Rosh Hashanah. So the Alter Rebbe says in 61 that Atan Nitzavim Hayim is referring to Rosh Hashanah. And what's happening? What does the pasuk say? To pass through this covenant with the Eibishter. That on Rosh Hashanah we renew this bris of his kashrus with the Eibishter. This bris which is renewed under Rosh Hashanah, where does it come from? Which level is it? Again, from the level of atzmus, which is beyond and higher than all revelation. As is also indicated by the two famous Mishalim of Tkiyah Shefer, Shehuvu Behemshech V'Kochal Ad Marash, which the Rebbe Marash brings in his famous Ma'amar Behemshech V'Kochal. By the way, I didn't point it out last week, but you notice that the Rebbe started off in the beginning quoting from the Baal Shem Tov, and then from the Magid, then from the Alter Rebbe, and he quoted in Gimel at the bottom, and then the Gimel from the Mittler Rebbe, and then Tzemach Tzedek is what the whole Ma'amar is, and now he's quoting from the Rebbe Marash, and he will quote from all the Rabbeim. The Rebbe did that always on Rosh Hashanah, and here he did it even in the Ma'amar of Erev Rosh Hashanah as well. He would quote from all the Rabbeim. And in later years, the Rebbe would also quote from his father too. So here he brings the two Mishalim that the Rebbe Marash brings in his Ma'amar V'Kocha. The Moshe Lechem B'Shem Baal Shem Tov, Ben Melech, the Moshe from a prince, the son of a king, who was, he distanced himself, he was estranged from his father's palace, and then one day he wanted to come back, but no one let him in because he didn't look like the prince, it didn't sound like the prince, he couldn't even speak the language anymore. He forgot the language of the king's country. So what did he do? He stood outside and he shouted out, "Father, Father." So this should sort B'Keil Poshut, or not even Father, Father, he just cried out. So he called out B'Keil Poshut. The king recognized that he hears through the window this noise, and he recognizes that this is the voice of his only child, his only son. Even though even though there was nothing there which was in the language of the Melech, it was nothing there which speaks normally to the Melech. But nonetheless, in the that simple cry achieved the chidush, the renewal of the bond between the Melech and his son. So the Baal Shem Tov says this is one of the mishalim for Rosh Hashanah because it's the renewal of the bris. So we don't come with big chidush Torah to be able, or big fancy ideas that we can come and impress the king and impress the Eibishter. Rather, we come with the most simplest of all cries, a tuneless, noteless soul sound, soul S-O-L-E, which is coming from the S-O-U-L, a lone sound. The Keil Poshet, but this Keil Poshet symbolizes the cry that comes from the Yiddish heart to the Eibishter. It's not even a language, it's normally, you would think, the sophisticated language for which the Eibishter would be impressed with. That's the mashal from the Baal Shem Tov. Mashal Beis is from the Rav Agorin, Achosav, and Lev Yitzchak Raditchev. who was famous as the Evi Yisrael, Hayadum Meforsa, the famous Evi Yisrael. So he brings from the Barditchever, Minyan Levushim. The Barditchever writes it, he refers to it in 63 in the Sefer Kedushas Halevi, his Sefer. He gives us a different mashal. But there he says the mashal of Levushim Pshutim. He doesn't elaborate here. Of the person with the simple clothing, the Levushim Lamatim, because Levushim is even lower than Keil Pashut. By putting on the simple clothing, he was able to renew the bond between the king and his good friend. You know the mashal? No. Okay. So the mashal the Kitzur was, when the Barditchev says, if everybody said yeah, I wouldn't have to say it. Don't worry. The mashal Barditchev says that there was a king who was traveling and something happened and he got lost and he got detached from his entourage. The Secret Service lost him and he got lost in a forest. And he was fablodget and got completely in the forest. And then there's a forest man, lived in the forest, and he sees him. The king comes up to him and he says, maybe you can tell me where we are. I'm lost. I'm the king. You're the king. You never saw the king before. Sure, I'll take you. And he led him out of the forest and he took him to the Derech HaMelech, to the yellow brick road, and he took him all the way back to the palace. The king, he was pushing, save my life. The king says to him, so I want to reward you. You no longer have to live a life of poverty in the forest. Come, bring your family here, and I'll give you next door to the palace and take care of all your needs forevermore. And that's it. And he went over there, and he put on fancy clothing. He became a ganze mensch. It came the day that he did something, whatever it was, he committed a crime, he committed an offense against the king, and the punishment is going to be very severe. I don't remember if he says that the punishment is going to be death. You have to look it up. So the king, of course, was the head of the court, and he's coming before the king and the head of the court, and it's life and death. So he asked that if he can come, he told the guards, when you take, I want to put on, he said, he doesn't want to wear his fancy clothing. He wants to be able to go home. He takes out of his cupboard the garments that he wore when he was in the forest the day that he met the king. The old shmata clothing that he was wearing then. And that's how he comes before the king. When he came before the king dressed that way, it reminded the melech, it reminded the king of all that happened then and how this person saved his life, and therefore it was able to mechadish the love, renew the love and appreciation that the king had for him, and therefore he got off. The king let him off. That's the mashal of the Barditchever. So he said the mashal of the Baal Shem Tov is with sound, with talk, with the voice. While here it's a mashal of levushim. So the Rebbe points out levushim is lamata mekel poshet. It's even lower level. In other words, it's even easier to awaken the Eibishter's, renew the Eibishter's bris with us, not just with kel, but even with levushim. Beautiful Sikha for Rosh Hashanah, or Rosh Hashanah, L'chuti Sichas Chelik Lamed Daled, if I remember correctly. It was Yud Shvat Toshim Memvav. The Rebbe made a scene then on Masechta Rosh Hashanah. And Yud Shvat, yeah. The Rebbe said he connected them with Chamishas B'Shvat, Rosh Hashanah Leilonis, so he made a scene on Masechta Rosh Hashanah, and then they were told these two stories, and he gave a whole beer, which later was printed in the L'chuti Sichas for Rosh Hashanah. So over there, the Rebbe elaborates and explains these two Mishalim in great detail, and how they express two different levels on Rosh Hashanah. Worthwhile to look. So what's the point of these two Mishalim? The Nekudas in Yinam Uven is Mishnei Mishalim Elohu. The Chidush HaBris V'Yiskashus, that the point of these two Mishalim is that the renewal of the covenant of the bris and the Yiskashus, which happens on Rosh Hashanah through Tchiyah Shefa, doesn't come any mitzvah b'chinas HaGiluyim. It's not coming because of Giluyim. We're not looking to impress the Eibishter. We have to blow shofar. That's as far as the gilui goes. But the shofar itself, the sound of the shofar, the instrument itself is not a sophisticated instrument. The sound is not a sophisticated sound. A simple coil doesn't even have the language of the melech. So it's not the sound, it's not the instrument that's impressive, that's achieving the chiddush of the bris. Rather, ki'im be'evin chadash shelo yadayin ma'ilam. So it's not because of the gilui, but rather we're trying to achieve something new that never was before, and that's the new gilui that comes on Rosh Hashanah, which the Alter Rebbe speaks about in Negeras HaKedesh. And the way to be able to achieve that is dafke through simplicity, not through giluyim.
one of the differences of Tikkun Leil Shavuos between Chassidim and the not Chassidim is that Chassidim, the Arizal tells us, you can say Tikkun Leil Shavuos. There's not much intellect involved. People like to have me involved. So we'll sit but have a shir and give a pilpul and give a shir. There's nothing wrong with that, of course. But Tikkun Leil Shavuos, the Arizal says, it's like Rosh Hashanah, as we're saying over here. It's a time we're going to experience Atzmos. To experience Atzmos, you don't want to get me in the way. So the Arizal gave us the formula. Read Tikkun Leil Shavuos. It's very simple, and it's for the big Rosh Yeshivas. What you're going to read Chumash, you're going to read the beginning and end of every parsha. It's not very sophisticated, but dafka through the unsophistication, that's how you're able to connect with the Atzmos. That's why even Tikkun Leil Shavuos is different between Chassidim and the others. There's a reason for it.